We're going to start our webinar this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you're from. So thank you very much for joining us today for the Peregrine Global Services webinar on the foundations of assurance of learning. I'm delighted to have such a big crowd of people joining us, over 300 registered people in our webinar today. And we really are a very global group. I was looking at the list of attendees, and I have people from Canada, the UK, Russia, Germany, India, Vietnam, Brazil, Switzerland, Suriname, China, Thailand, Bangladesh, Brunei Darussalam, Honduras, of course, the United States. And I'm coming to you from Paris, France. And there are others, but that's what the portion that I could see on the list. So let me get started for our webinar. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Paul Millette. I'm the European, Middle East, Asian Director of Operations for Peregrine Global Services. And my role is really to help schools in these regions develop quality assurance within their institutions. I work with many schools with regard to learning outcomes. So hopefully I'll be able to provide some useful information to the group. Originally from the great city of Boston, but have lived here in the City of Light for about 30 years. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina Perry, my very capable colleague. So you're lucky to have a nice group today. So Christina, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Paul. And my name is Christina Perry. I am in Wyoming, in the Rocky Mountain region of the United States. And I see we have quite a few of our client schools from the U.S. here, as well as Paul mentioned, a variety of people from around the world. What's really interesting is Paul has a lot of experience working with institutions of higher education, helping them with their self-studies, working through the accreditation process. I work more in the development of new services and solutions. So my role here will be, once Paul kind of explains the process of the assurance of learning cycle, we're going to get a little bit deeper into some possible methods for evaluating learning outcomes. And that's where I'm coming in to describe a service for soft skill evaluation. So thank you.
Great. So, and behind the scenes, you can't see, we have another person, Casey, who's joining us from Wyoming as well, and she's going to help monitor some of the questions as they come in. So let's get to our presentation. Of course, we'd like to open it up to everybody to communicate with us via their microphones, but 300 people talking at the same time might be difficult. So we do have some poll questions that we would ask you, if you will, participate in. That gives you an opportunity to express yourself, like helps us understand where you are, what you know, what you're doing. We're going to, of course, collect any questions. There's a question pane that you're invited to write in any kind of questions that you might have or comments. We will have time at the end of the presentation to address some of these questions. However, as often is the case, we don't get to every single question, but please do write them in because we will address, Christina and I will address the questions that you asked to the best of our ability in our follow-up to the webinar.
Hey, Paul, we just had one question real quick.
Sure.
There was a question that came up, just said, will we be sharing the recording? We are recording this presentation. It's good to disclose that before we get started.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and we can make this available to people after the webinar. So yes, rest assured, there will be a copy of the recording.
Yeah, and it's something that we would encourage you to share with colleagues in your institution or others if you're interested in. And I'll just put a plug in saying that both Christina and I would be happy to meet with institutions or people individually to cover the material here or otherwise, and our colleagues in the States and throughout the world would certainly be happy to reach out to you to do this presentation as well. So let's begin by looking at obviously the notion of quality assurance through learning outcomes, because this is really the crux of our presentation today, is trying to find ways that we as institutions, I use the word we because I have for many years been involved in higher education my entire career, and on the teaching side, administrative side. So when I use the word we, I kind of still identify as working with an institution of higher learning. So when institutions are looking to improve the quality throughout their institutions, one of the great tools that can help is the development and the process of learning outcomes, creating and assessing your learning outcomes. It's interesting to step back a little bit and look at why this all came about. Learning outcomes really have been around for a long time in primary and secondary education. In higher education, it really came about 20 years ago, sort of more in the vogue of things. It's not that it didn't exist, but accreditors in particular have been adding this as a requirement in a standard or principle within the rest of their requirements. So it's been really generating more interest, obviously, in the part of schools to be able to meet this requirement. But this is something that has developed over really within the last 20 years, and really now very much ingrained in the accreditation process and the quality assurance process for institutions. Now, within higher education, really it was developed for a number of reasons. I just picked a few here. This notion of retained knowledge and integrated knowledge, or we actually use it in two ways. Really, the schools are expected to put into place a method to evaluate what students are expected to know and be able to do, their competencies at the end of the program generally. So this is one of the key tenets of learning outcomes, is measuring retained or integrated knowledge with a process of using tools to measure that. And I'm talking here about the program level, not talking about course level. I will get to that in a minute. Second is to really work towards improving in a continuous way what's happening at the school and in programs. So making changes as a result of what you find out from measuring your established learning outcomes, so that you understand where your strengths and weaknesses are, and or obviously go back to your program to make some changes to mitigate those weaknesses and reevaluate the next cohort, so you can see if in fact what you've done has made a difference in learning. So really continuous improvement based on, and I put in quotes here, objective data of student learning. And that's critical here. There's a lot of subjective collection that's important to do, but objective collection is critical to a good learning outcomes program. And then finally, transparency and accountability. This engagement that you will make to student learning, which demonstrates to stakeholders, including accreditors, parents, students, employers. This is really important. There are many accreditation agencies which actually ask you to present the results of your learning outcomes, to report them. This is very common here in Europe. So there's an engagement to the student learning and an accountability and transparency. As I mentioned, accreditation is a critical part, or is playing a critical part in requiring learning outcomes assessment. There's a lot of different words that are used. Some accreditors use learning objectives, learning goals, assurance of learning. I'm going to broadly use the term learning outcomes. So this is a requirement now, a major requirement, or one of the requirements of all accrediting bodies. And I have a list here, many based in the United States, which are regional accreditors, international accreditors in business, as well as, I didn't have enough room on my slide to put all of them, but you'll see some familiar logos here that if you're from the States or international, you will have seen these accreditors. And we at Peregrine do very specific webinars for each one of these accreditation agencies, and highlight those accreditation requirements that we are expected as an education technology company to understand the accreditation requirements all accreditation requirements, but in particular learning outcomes, because it's such an essential part of what we do with institutions we work with. So with all of these organizations, it's a lot of work. We have a full-time person who manages all of the learning outcomes processes that are required by all of these organizations, so that what we filter back to you as institutions is in alignment with their requirements. So that's a very important component for you to understand, that we work very closely with these accreditors so that what we're doing is in alignment. Now, we're going to open our first poll, which is to ask you a question here, and I'll ask Christina to open this first
Yep,
poll so
I'll go
you'll
ahead and
see it on
launch
your
that
screen.
one.
So she'll launch the poll. Now, the question that we're asking here is, do your academic programs have learning outcomes for? Now, this is very general. We don't have a lot of room on these polls, so I broke it down into four responses. Core, or your fundamental subjects. So if you have a business program, those core business courses that students are required. If you're a healthcare program or criminal justice or other programs, the basic core courses that are expected. Do you have learning outcomes for those core subject areas? I bring in soft skills. These are the competencies that relate to communications, creativity, negotiations, teamwork. This is a broad category of learning outcomes, which most institutions will have integrated into their learning outcomes. Do you do it for both? Or have you not yet put into place your learning outcomes process or assessment? That sometimes happens. We have some new schools on board, or some schools that are going through some changes and they're reestablishing this. So we'll see what we come up with for percentages on each one of these.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, we've had, oh, gosh, 70%, 3/4 of people have voted. I'll leave it just a
Great.
minute more. But it looks like we're at about 60% of respondents have both outcomes for soft skills and those core fundamental subjects. About 40% just have for the core fundamental subjects. We don't have anybody reporting not having learning outcomes. So I'll go ahead and share that. We've had almost everybody vote. So
Great.
share. Okay, there we go.
Great. So as you can see, actually, that's great news to sort of address this, because we are talking about having learning outcomes, how to efficiently use them, how to create them, and how to measure them. So we've got a lot of schools that are using both for soft and fundamental skills, which is good news. And you can share this with others, as I said, for helping build the knowledge of what really should be taking place within institutions. So one of the questions that comes up with learning as outcomes is, how can we as institutions meet this particular requirement? So I'm going to, again, step back a little bit and look at one of the most common tools used in continual improvement or continuous improvement. Has been used. This is the Deming cycle. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And this has been used in business and industry for many years. Now we've adapted it to higher education and student learning. So when you're looking at this this cycle of creating your assessment process, when I meet with schools and I work with them sort of either through accreditation, reaccreditation, or just looking at it from a different way, I say, okay, let's identify your learning outcomes based on your institution, what you want your students to be able to do and know at the end of their academic programs. So each academic program might have slightly different ones or specializations. So you identify those learning outcomes. You're not trying to identify every single thing that happens in the institution, but those major categories that define you as an institution and what your expectations students what expectations you have for your students, so that they carry with them when they're working when they're out there in the workplace, these competencies. So thinking about it in terms of what baggage they're carrying with them as they move into the work environment. Obviously, looking at objectives and the assessment tools and process is very important, because you have to create some identified objectives that you're going to try to measure, and then the tools that you're going to use to put into place to measure. So of course, this is our P, the plan part of the Deming cycle. Next is our do, which is we actually put into place the process of assessment, of assessing our learning outcomes. And there are a lot of different ways. Peregrine, we have a number of different tools that are used to assess learning outcomes. We'll give you a couple of examples, but I work with schools that use business games, simulations, capstone courses, theses, dissertations. There's a number of different ways, and obviously we're going to speak a little bit about Peregrine, but I sort of work with all of the options that are presented at a school and look at how they can create something that they can have good data and do some good analysis, and we'll get into that in a minute. Obviously, it's important to share what you find out, because you're going to find out what you do well and what your students aren't doing so well at. So it's really related to the learning process, so we can identify where things are going well and where we might want to improve it. And then we find out, with that information, we're able to make some decisions about, when we're looking at our program, going back to make adjustments to the areas in which we've identified weaknesses in order to mitigate those weaknesses for the next round. So we put changes. This is the continual improvement process, that change process. And it's important that we look at this every cycle, that we're looking at the results of what we did last year. Did it make a difference? And then continually putting this process into place. So the Plan, Do, Study, Act is part of the Deming cycle, that if you're interested in a much more detailed version of this, I can certainly work with you individually, but this is a nice way of managing that process and being able to identify those areas that may need to have improvement. One point here, having worked with schools across the globe, one of the things that many institutions mistakenly think about accreditation is that they're expected to have all of their learning outcomes met. This is a mistake that schools make, because if an accreditor sees that you've listed all your learning outcomes and you say we've met, the accreditor wonders, well, how is it that you can be perfect? You're not digging deep enough to find out where you can improve, how you can improve. Your accreditation or reaccreditation is not based on meeting all of your learning outcomes. Your accreditation is based on a process for evaluating them and coming up with ways to improve your academic programs based on the results of the process that you've used. So it's an important distinguishing feature that many schools mistakenly think, oh, I have to meet every single accreditation learning outcome in order for me to stay accredited and be accredited. It's much more important for you to identify where your strengths and weaknesses are and address them and continually ramp up your quality assurance measures. So
good point,
we're
Paul.
going
I really like that. Thanks.
but it is interesting how I have looked at many different dossiers and reports, and I step back and say, well, it sounds like you're awful perfect here. Let's look a little deeper, and I generally find areas that can be used for improvement. Now, it's important today, Christine and I are really going to talk about program level assessments, this summative assessment. There are two types of assessments, really, well, many, but here I'm mentioning two. One is formative, which happens in a course or a module, which is critical for an institution that all their courses or modules are, every student is assessed in every module. And then there's summative or program level assessments. So these are both critical to the success of an institution in terms of identifying where they can find room for improvement and improving learning. So as you can see, for course level assessments, I've mentioned several things here in terms of improving an integral part of the learning process, how to improve learning. It is used to motivate students, because if they're doing poorly on one test, they know that they need to work hard to get a better score on their next test. And it obviously is related to the teaching. Each teacher, I've been a teacher, I know that when I see students doing extremely well or not so well, it I bring into question, how can I do better in the classroom? Where program assessment is really looking generally at the end of the program and is comprehensive. It's not just one module generally, but all of what we're expecting students to know. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this, and I'll get into that. And it's used, as I said, for an accountability to improving overall program success, as well as being able to measure this knowledge that's retained and this knowledge that's integrative. So one of the important components when you're looking at end of program, this is what we expect students to know. So they really shouldn't be studying a lot for their end of program assessments. They should already know it. Another sort of rubs schools sometimes the wrong way. Well, students have to prepare for it. Well, if they're expected after 4 years of undergraduate in the US, 3 years here in Europe and in Asia, and they're expected to have this knowledge, then they're expected to have it. So this retained knowledge, that's why I use the retained, should be something that they know. So we look at these two different types of assessments as being critical for every institution. Now, when we're looking at the notion of a summative or a program level, we can break it down into two ways, direct and indirect measures of student learning. As I mentioned, this is direct, which is actually testing students on their knowledge, putting them down and asking them questions. Do you remember the product lifecycle from business? Can you identify how to calculate the cost of capital? You know, those kinds of things which are basic knowledge that they should know by the time they finished maybe an undergraduate in business or an MBA program. So retained knowledge, these are, you're expected to capture this information, this retained knowledge. Now this can be done as a standalone assessment that's done towards the end of a program, sometimes, as I said, in a capstone course, a thesis, or a multiple choice or some type of comprehensive test. But it also can be embedded in a course, meaning that if you have different classes or courses, modules, that within that module or course, there's something that's happening that is related to one of your learning outcomes. So it's sort of embedded, so each faculty person for each student for each class has to collect that data. Now, many people in the room know that there are a lot of big Excel spreadsheets that are designed to capture this information, and it's a heavy administrative process and a lot of number crunching. So there are efficient ways to do this, but there are many institutions that do a mix of embedded and some other types of I would say, somewhat more efficient tools to measure learning outcome. And as I said, it's a continuous process within the institutions that are generally used to evaluate the success of programs, as I say. Now, indirect is really the attitudes, the opinions, and sort of third party, which means the students are reporting either at the end of their program as an exit interview, it could be alumni, and I usually encourage institutions to integrate into their exit interviews, alumni surveys, questions around learning outcomes. So if you've developed a set of learning outcomes, turn those into questions on those surveys so that you, the student or alumni, can give you feedback as an institution on how they think you're doing. So this is indirect measure of student learning, obviously, because it's coming third party. Now, generally, this can be done, as I said, with interviews. It can be done with course evaluations or surveys. There are a number of different ways. I can obviously speak to both of these tools, direct and indirect measures, in much more detail, but just wanted to present to you that there are two tools that you use, and usually in conjunction. Most accreditors now are requiring both. So you have direct and indirect measures with learning outcomes today. Now, one of the big questions that comes up, why can't I use grades? I mean, this is, I am collecting all of this data in my formative, assessments. Can't I just use the average grades that my students are receiving to identify that they've done well in marketing? This is one of my learning outcomes, the core business areas and marketing. My average students are doing 80 to 90% of their final grade, so I'm happy. Well, unfortunately, you can't. And the reason you can't is because here's an example I have a marketing course, and you can see each one of these activity in a marketing course has a different weight, a coefficient, as you will. I have 2 different students. As you will notice, both of the students have the same final grade. But when you dig a little deeper, you'll notice that student one, doesn't do so well in their exams, where student 2 has done fairly well on their exams, 90%, not so bad. Now, even using the exams as a tool, it's not all the exams, it's only certain portions of the exam that you would be gathering information for your learning outcomes. So again, we don't use final grades because this doesn't measure class participation. Is not learning. It's important, but it's not based on learning. My group presentation is a group presentation, so everybody gets 1 grade, but I can have, some people who are stronger. The papers are individual, so they're not on the same subject. So you can see that this is very challenging to use, and that's why most accreditors worth the money you pay them should not be accepting final grades. So that's why you have to have a process that looks at more of the summative end of program assessment. Now you still have to do this, but it's not used for evaluating learning outcomes. So what we want to do is to make sure that we create learning outcomes that are objective, comprehensive, and measurable. We start with our friend Bloom's. Benjamin Bloom's, University of Chicago, created this taxonomy, which many people in the room have used and know. Obviously, we have lower order skills, higher order skills, and when you're developing your learning outcomes, you're basically your undergraduates on the first 3, your postgraduate, graduate students are on the top 3. We stay away from using the words on the left-hand side of your screen to the ones on your right hand, because those are measurable. They can be measured, they're objective, so we use the Bloom's taxonomy. Now, I'm going to move a little quickly because I don't want to use all of our time here on this little explanation. So I want to just show you an example of some learning outcomes based on degree level. And I have 8 different learning outcomes. I don't have to use all of them, but these are the ones I've identified. I can use them over a couple of years. You'll notice that the words that I use in these learning outcomes are based on the Bloom's taxonomy. I move up to the masters. You'll notice that those are a little bit more challenging as well as doctoral. So here I have 3 levels and I've developed learning outcomes relating to that. Now I want to thank the IACBE, which has graciously allowed me to use some of this information. This is borrowed from them very liberally, so I'm going to thank them here, full disclosure. Now, I have an example of a learning outcomes plan with some objectives, and I've decided to use it for an MBA program. Here, I've chosen 6 learning outcomes. I have my core business disciplines listed on the bottom that are going to be evaluated. You'll notice critical thinking, teamwork, communications, etc. are my soft skills that I'm going to be evaluating. I have those learning outcomes. Now I've set up some objectives. And those objectives, you'll notice, are quantifiable. 80% of the graduates will receive a score of 3.5 or better on a tool that I've decided to use, which is an evaluation of 360 of their critical thinking. Now, if you move down to business core, I'm using an end of program comprehensive assessment tool to measure those 10 business competencies. So I've come up with some very clear objectives that I'm going to use to measure my learning outcomes. And this will give me the data that I can go and look at where my strengths and weaknesses are for my entire cohort. Not my individual students, although the data will be provided for individual students. I'm really looking at this for my cohort. So next poll question is, do you objectively measure learning outcomes? So here, you can launch that for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and Paul, I just want to thank you. I mean, that really was, I liked how you had the learning outcomes and then the objectives. It kind of goes to that, a goal without a plan is just a wish. How are you
Exactly.
actually going to measure these?
Yeah. I have a lot of wishes. I'm not too planned. Anyway, so here's the next poll. Do you objectively measure learning outcomes? So again, this is pretty general. I understand that, I don't have a lot of detail here. So yes, we do it for all learning outcomes are objectively measured. Somewhat, most of our learning outcomes are objectively measured, or we're not currently objectively measuring our learning outcomes. So that's an important question. I know that the term objective can be confusing with subjective, obviously, but think of it, I know I have an audience that understands what I mean here. That's why I put up objective with a percentage and a score that I'm trying to seek, rather than something that's completely subjective. So we'll
Okay.
see how our audience is doing in this particular poll question.
Okay. Well, it looks like we have almost 3/4 people voting, so I'll go ahead and close
Okay,
it and
go ahead and
share.
yep.
There we go. So some people are actually doing all learning outcomes with objective measurement, but most of them have some of their learning outcomes objectively
Okay.
measured.
Yeah, and that is very common, and I think it's not something you should ever feel bad about, because sometimes
Mhm.
you don't have the tools or the
Right.
resources or the interest, and you may not need to every single cycle assess every single one, and that's important. It depends on the type of accreditor you're working with and what you want to do for your institution. I think it's important to do it on an occasional basis, that you are measuring on an objective level. Now, coming up with objective tools is going to lead us into our the next part of our presentation, but we're going to I'll let Christina introduce you to an option here that we're going to offer to our participants today.
Sure, absolutely. And this is really uh I'm sorry. I was listening to Paul present. I forgot I had to say something. But Peregrine does provide this assurance of learning online module, online course, which is something that we've used in workshops with higher education institutions that are looking into initial accreditation or reaffirmation. And this is just a really thorough, comprehensive online module that walks through all the steps of the strategic planning behind the assurance of learning, the context you're using it in, and then the curriculum mapping for assessing your learning outcomes. So if you want more information about the process, the more than we can cover in just this short webinar, we'll give you a chance at the end of today's presentation to request that, and we'll send you free access to that online course.
Yeah, and this covers really the A to Z in assurance and learning outcomes. I mean, literally for virtually every accreditation agencies and the basic principles. So as Christina said, please wait at the end and she'll bring up a poll to ask if you would like this really nice learning module and work yourself through it. Now, I'm going to quickly go through some of the tools that Peregrine has developed to help in this learning outcomes assessment solution. We are an organization that does a lot of assessments, and these are the different areas and disciplines in which we provide assessment. But in our example today, we're really just going to look at business administration and workplace soft skills, just to give you an idea. For the assessments, for example, in business administration, the tool is very similar to all of the ones at the very top, and then Christina will talk about workplace, which is significantly different than the way we run the assessments. So I'm going to go, and as I said, we're each going to pick a part of this, and I'm going to start with business administration, which is a programmatic assessment tool. Schools are able to select the topics that align with their programs. So as you can see, we have 13 different topics that usually align with your core competencies in a business program. If it's a criminal justice or a healthcare, we have the same kind of thing where you can select those topics. You're not limited or restricted to the number of topics. You can choose as many or as few as you want. Now, one of the important things in the cycle of assessment is if you find, for example, in this particular topic area of integration and strategic management, your students didn't score as well as you want, they weren't at that 80%, they were at 40%, then you have to ask yourself a question, what could we do to improve? But this is such a broad area that it doesn't give me enough information. So Peregrine has developed what we call the subject areas under each one of these topics. So that allows you to really dig deeper in the the topic area to determine which part of that particular subject are students having problems with. So you're not redoing everything in the courses that might touch on strategy or integration with business. You're looking at some very specific areas. So it allows you to look, and we provide data on your cohort and individual students on each one of these subject areas. So if it's really around the operational side or decision making that they're having weaknesses, again, going back to your program and making some changes in courses that deal with this to see if you improve on the next area. We offer a number of different additional topics. Important to keep in mind that we have the ability for schools to set up their own topics that we provide on our testing platform. So I work with a lot of schools who have multiple languages, so they want to have it in French, or they want to have it in Russian, or they want to have it in another language, or if you have a special topic area that you want, we will work with you to have that integrated into the assessment, either individually or with our test banks. Obviously, these are aligned with learning outcomes, integrate into your LMS system very easily, both on undergraduate and graduate. We have a super client admin site, which allows you to download all of the reports and an analysis on your own. We provide training for that. It allows you to benchmark against like institutions. So we have what are called aggregate pools for US institutions based on different accreditors, or if I have European or non-European, or so you're able to benchmark yourself against others. We have extensive security measures. Remember, we've had, I think, surpassed 2 years ago, 1 million tests provided to students. So we have a lot of experience with security. I have a whole section on security, but I don't have time today to go into that. And then it addresses accreditation requirements. Just a couple examples of reports. We have an internal analysis report, which allows you to compare topics and subject levels. External comparison report, as I mentioned, to look at yourself compared to other like institutions, or demographics, or longitudinal reports that allow you to look over time at how students have done from 1 year to the next, which is critical. And all of these reports can be provided directly to your accreditors, making it very easy for you to write a simple narrative of what you're doing to improve it. So at the end, students receive a wonderful completion certificate. Students love this. They often add it to their CVs or resumes as you stay in the States. So this is a nice tool that can be used. Now, I know I went through that very quickly. I'm more than happy to address this with you individually if you like. My email's at the end of this. So I'm going to turn it over to my trusted colleague who's been patiently waiting here, Christina, to take over on a value skill.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and swap screens here. Okay, just give me a second here. Thank you, Paul. Slideshow from there. Okay, thank you, Paul, for that introduction into defining and measuring learning outcomes. What I'm going to share with you now is a method for evaluating interpersonal competencies, and this how Peregrine can help mitigate some of the challenges you have with assessing soft skills. I'm going to sorry, I'm kind of getting my screen all set up here. Okay. First of all, Paul had shown you some sample learning outcomes that he'd gleaned from IECB. I borrowed some from another MBA program, and I just want to walk through some sample learning outcomes that you might have. This is for a graduate program. But here were some of the program level learning outcomes. Students will lead themselves and others. They will think critically and make decisions, maximize resources for the benefit of society, operate effectively in cross-cultural settings, analyze complex data, understand financial implications, and understand the complexity of business ethics. Now, what I find really interesting about this is many of you have learning objectives that are centered on the types of knowledge a graduate will have upon completion. But a lot of you have these type of learning objectives that are focused more on conduct and principles of graduates as they head out into the world. So as you can see in this list, 5 of these 6 learning outcomes reflect behavior, such as being a leader or respecting diversity or working effectively in teams. So those are a little bit more difficult to measure. while we understand the importance of soft skills and their relevance in the workplace, evaluating these program-wide objectives can be a challenge. Um, and here are some of the difficulties that we come into that we encounter. Soft skills can be difficult to define. Two people might have completely different ideas of what we mean by critical thinking, for example. There's a lack of standardized measures. What Paul and I might think of as ethical performance might be different. Hopefully not. Hopefully we're on the same page. But
Yeah, we are.
anyway, and also measuring your own interpersonal competencies. We have we could be lacking in self-awareness, so those can be difficult to measure as well. Um, so in light of these difficulties, what Peregrine is proposing is a new instrument to evaluate soft skill proficiency. We've designed this new solution called a value skills, which is modeled after 360-degree assessments used in industry. And I'm sure that many of you have taken a 360-degree assessment. They rely on a variety of perspectives on a person's relative strengths and weaknesses. So we have created a bank of assessment items, which encompass hundreds of potential soft skills that you can choose from. And then we've created statements and behaviors for each level of performance on a 1 to 5 rating, so that when I'm going in and evaluating someone and Paul's evaluating someone, we have common ground on what we mean by those different types of performance. So here, I just wanted to show you the screenshot. So shows some of the available skills that are in our assessment items bank. There are over 200 different skills. So what we would do is work with an institution to say, what are your learning outcomes that you're trying to measure in these interpersonal competencies? We'll create an instrument for you based on these items that you can review and then say, okay, I like these, but I want to add something else. I can also add in one of my own assessment items if I think that, I have a particular program in healthcare that I think patient advocacy is a skill I want to measure. For example, I can create my own definition and the different scaling and rubrics associated with that skill. I like to have an image in my presentations, and I know this. People ask, what does pizza have to do with soft skills?
I know,
Well,
and it's supper time here,
I
you
know,
know?
comfort food. But the analogy here relates to customizable instruments. So if I'm going to a pizzeria, they have a lot of different pizzas on the menu, and I can just pick one that looks good. It's a bestseller. But if I don't see what I'm in the mood for, I can create my own, right? Well, here for value skills, we've created the same idea. So we have some pizzas or some assessment evaluations on the menu. But if you want to create your own, you can choose from the different ingredients, being the assessment items, the different soft skills, to create the instrument that fits your learning objectives. So here, for example, I had one and I thought, well, attention to detail isn't very important in my program. I have a more creative program. It's an artistic program. I'm scratching that one. I'm going to add in collaboration and innovation. Those are more important to my program. So I just wanted to get to the point that you can create these to fit your tastes. Now, as for objectivity, one of the problems in assessing soft skills and coming up with that reliable measure of your students' performance on those outcomes is that no two people might mean the same thing. So what we've done is create rubrics that the evaluators can look at when they're evaluating a participant. And what I like to say is it's good to start at a number 3, competent meets expectations, and say, okay, what is that level of performance? Is that how I think of this person? And then go either up or down from there. So here, for example, we're looking at critical thinking and problem solving skills. And if we look at the competent behavior, this is a person who approaches problems in new, innovative ways, is not afraid of asking what if to explore previously unimagined options and discuss them impartially. I could say, okay, this person is that's their rating, but maybe they're someone who's really exceptional. So then in that case, the example here shows they're naturally creative. They're able to work backwards and imagine steps that will lead to the desired results. They have a wide range of studies and view things from different perspectives of history, geography, religion, or economics. Well, that's a whole different level of performance entirely. So here my 5 means something different than my 3. And then again, if we have someone who's unsatisfactory, this is someone who does not like non-traditional ideas and really falls back on what they've always known. So that gives us an ability to get a more reliable measure. And then the platform as you can create your different, we won't call them pizzas, we'll call them assessment instruments, but you can create different ones for your program or for different programs, and you can administer them over time. So for example, maybe I have some incoming MBA students. I want to run an evaluation for all that incoming cohort. And then at the end of their program, once they've done some internships or if they've done some experiential learning, they've done some group projects, I want to measure their growth. I can assess them again and see where they've improved and get their average scores before and after. Or this is nice if you want to compare programs of specializations. In a business program, are my accounting concentration, do they have different soft skills than my marketing concentration? And just to see, are they really meeting the different outcomes for different levels? So that's a little bit about the reason behind this. I know that we're kind of, I'm looking at my time here. I'm going to kind of rush through a little bit of how it's performed, but definitely reach out to me afterwards if you want to know more about this. The participants in this case are your students usually who would be evaluated, but this could also be used for faculty development, or it could be used for professional staff development. Any group that you want to measure how they're performing in soft skills, you could set up an assessment for them. The participants will receive an email to log into the platform and create their profile for this assessment. That could mean that they upload a profile picture, which is really nice, especially if you have the same people evaluating several participants. They kind of have a little picture there to see, okay, who am I thinking of this time? And then the participant can select evaluators for themselves, or the administrator can do that. But sometimes it's nice to get, a full, maybe you want 6 or 10 evaluators per participant. They'll think about who they've worked with on projects, who has experience with them, maybe a mentor or an advisor that could give feedback. The participant can also do a self-evaluation where they rate themselves on each of those skills, which is really nice for that critical self-reflection to think, okay, how am I really on working with others? And then they get to read what an ideal behavior might be and what a substandard behavior might be. And they can also, once they've collected the feedback from their evaluators, they've got the ratings and any written comments that the evaluators put in, they can run a report that will show them their relative strengths and weaknesses and also let them develop an action plan. Now, from the evaluator perspective, say I'm a participant. I've invited Paul to give feedback on my relative competencies. Paul will have the invitation, log in, and then he'll go line by line through the different skills. He can do this on his phone, his iPad, his computer, and he'll rate me on each of those things. So in this example, we're looking at fairness, and one of the criteria is does not play favorites. So he'll scroll through and see which matches his behavior, his experience with me, choose that, and then he has the option to leave some written comments at the bottom saying that Christina struggles to reach out to new people. She seems to always work with the same group she's always worked with, or something like that. But these will be anonymous comments that I receive that cause me to think more about my behavior and grow. So once Paul's finished evaluating me, he can go back and review, he can save it, he can come back later, he can add additional comments, but he'll also know that his ratings and comments are not attributed to him. I won't know. They'll just come as a compiled aggregate score to me and a list of comments. So that is really the gift of feedback, is seeing things that you can't see for yourself. Now, for the reporting capabilities, the participant receives their individual results and scores, which is very good for their personal and professional development. But also we provide a group report, which is what we're looking at here for that learning outcomes assessment, is that the group will be able to show over time how they've grown, how much feedback they received, what types of comments they're getting, and be able to make adjustments in that plan, do, study, act cycle. So here in a participant report, we'll have an example of how well I, as a participant, scored across all of the items I was being evaluated on. The blue vertical line shows my mean score across all topics, so I'll see that anything that fell to the right of there is a relative strength. Here, curiosity and global awareness are strengths for me, but sadly, business ethics is an area of concern. So that would cause some real pause for me, and I'd have to go back and see what might cause those type of reactions and where I can develop. The in those relative strengths and weaknesses, I'll have an action plan at the end of my report, and I can also log into the platform and type in what actions I'm going to take, what timeline I'm going to hold myself to, who I might involve to hold me accountable. And this is something that I can save and use over time. And then the administrator will have access to group reports. So like I'd mentioned earlier, the example of evaluating an incoming cohort of MBA students and then maybe reassessing them at the end of the program. My program group reports will show the strengths and weaknesses of the group as a whole, as well as the distribution. So I can see, do we have people who are, say, really good at public speaking and people who really struggle with that? Perhaps we could pair them up. We could do some sort of group work in class, or we could, we could also see the trend of self-awareness. We can see if my group on average rates themselves much higher than their evaluators do, we can see some sort of potential blind spots there. We can also track the frequency of different ratings so that we can see that perhaps, if the results are skewed because some people are getting all fives and some people are getting all ones, that'll show us a little bit the distribution there.
And just one second here. I mean, I think this brings up a great objective measure that one of our participants asked about objectivity. And when you have data like you're showing us, Christina, you are able to actually collect that data on something that's very hard sometimes to collect objective data on soft skills. What I call the fundamentals or hard skills, those kinds of competencies. When someone takes a test, it's either good or bad. And where here you're able to, on a group level, really identify in a quantifiable way, which I think for, the institution, the student themselves, because you have the individual report, but also a cohort understanding that. And if you go back and look at the learning outcomes that, were developed and how this allows you to get that sort of objective as best you can. It's never 100%. Each evaluator will have some bias built in. There's no question. That's why having, I think you say, good to have about 5 people helps remove some of that. So just wanted to add, the importance of this for the objectivity.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. And so that we're able to get to a couple questions before we get the end, I just want to go ahead and I'm going to go to the last poll question because the value skills, I think we defined here that the benefit is that we can create a customizable instrument that reflects your learning outcomes. We could administer it across a program as a whole, and it can help students develop their own workplace skills, but it can also give the program the data it needs to improve the program. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and launch the last poll here, and then we'll get to some questions, okay? So this poll question here is, how can we help you? What do you need from us?
Yeah, so please, you're not going to bother us if you ask for more information. As I said, I have set up many follow-up meetings with schools after doing presentations like this to talk in general about this. I know I do. I'm engaged to discuss and I believe in the services and solutions Peregrine provides, but I also like to approach an institution by looking at what's happening in your institution. We have other solutions as well. We have writing solutions. We have solutions for helping experiential learning, as well as looking at what you're currently doing. This is a really important thing to not have to reinvent the wheel if you're doing things that are successful. So do reach out to us, and again, this online learning assurance module is pretty significant in the information it provides.
Yeah, thank you. And as I can see that we have definitely more than 100%, so that's good. You can select more than one option here, and we'll provide our contact information at the end. But we're going to use this list to get back to you and provide you the information you need. So I'll go ahead, and it looks like we did get about 3/4 of people responding here. I'm going to go ahead and close that, and we'll follow. We'll end here with some questions and our contact information. Okay. So there we go. Paul, are we back on the main screen now?
I haven't changed the screen, so you're in charge there on that side. So you can just go. You can just move ahead on your
Here
side.
we go. We'll just go to
I'll let you be the boss now.
Okay. So we'll just go ahead and take questions, and I'm going to go ahead and put up our contact information here. But let's go ahead and see if people have any questions for us.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking at the questions. I know that there are not that many, So I think we must have done a really good job, Christina.
Yeah, I'm sure that was.
There's some people are just sending their hellos. My friend Kamrul from Bangladesh, as I mentioned, and I have another person I've worked with, Hani from Beirut, and he asked a question about really to discuss the notion of objective data, and I was kind of making fun of it, but it is a challenge, the notion of objective data, because when I use the term objective data, it really means something that you can add a number to, so to speak. And if you looked at my learning outcomes, I had a lot of numbers there. I had something that you would able to sort of a criteria, a benchmark, an objective that you're trying to meet. So if you look at those that I developed, I said I didn't say 100% of all my graduates. I said 80% reached a score of 70%. So it meant most of my students did this on the tool that I'm using. So if I'm talking about the end of program comprehensive assessment, then I can look at their scores in each one of the functional areas and see if they're in that objective measure. So I have some numbers there that I'm looking at. And that allows me, and if I'm looking at it on the cohort, it allows me to really address that on the program level. So as I said, looking at digging deep into the information that you get from those assessments to determine, okay, now we are going to make, add some additional information about, I don't know, the marketing plan, because that's where our students weren't doing so well. So, I address that in my academic program. I meet with my faculty members. They kind of come up with some additional activities. Then we go through the assessment again, using got to use the same data on 2 points to get good, reliable information. I assess that the next cohort that's gone through that, and then I then can compare to see if, I notice that instead of 40%, I'm at 70% of my students who have, achieved what I want them to achieve. I'm not quite there yet, but I know that I'm getting there. So
Mhm.
that's when you can kind of use those tools. And as Christina said, when you have a tool like a 360, you're getting sort of, that's the point, 360 view of the candidate, the person. And it's better to have a good mix so that you can avoid,
Mhm.
again, the notion of subjectivity. And
Mhm.
if you're able to capture data based on a number, we
Mhm.
want our students to score, at least 3.5 on these Likert scales that the evaluators are evaluating, then that's a nice way of having something quantifiable that I can use to benchmark, myself with what I'm hoping will
Mhm.
happen. I don't know if you wanted to add more on that
No,
for the discussion.
yeah, I think that that's great. We do have another question here about are self-evaluations considered indirect measures for the assessment process? And I got to say that it kind of depends. I know that we do like in evalu skills, the purpose of the self-assessment isn't really to so much as an indirect measure. It's more to detect blind spots and find that lack of self-awareness in certain areas, and it can actually be used to determine weaknesses in your program if you find that your students are overrating themselves in something and evaluators are underrating them. But we do use sort of an indirect measure, I would say more in the knowledge-based assessment. We can add a student survey to the beginning of exams where you ask students how well they feel they met certain learning objectives, that type of thing. And as those responses can be an indirect measure of how well students are achieving learning outcomes, because they are a little bit more subjective that way. But I suppose, I don't know, Paul, do you think of that in evalu skills as the self-assessment?
Um, I do actually. I think it's nice to have it, but I also, it can be, as I said, when you're having the third party, I think you can use it as, it's the context in which you use it. I think you can
Mhm.
use it as an indirect measure. I actually do think you could use it that way.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
All right, so we actually have a lot of questions. I'm looking at one. How does this work in times of COVID when learning is becoming more online mode and very few in-class assignments? So this is obviously both tools are adapted, are designed for online. So our assessments can be taken in a proctored, invigilated environment where you put students in a room and make them take a test, or individually at their own, on their own, at a you can set up a frame of time in which they have to do it, so that I don't think you should reduce class assignments because of COVID. I think you have to come up with different types of class
Right.
assignments, and that's the challenge of doing it. And then, as Christina said, there certainly is the opportunity with evaluate skills for that to be completely, done online. There doesn't need to be, presence in order to do that evaluation. So I think that, yes, both of these can work obviously in that environment. And we do have presentations on how to make your online teaching more effective and to move away from thinking what you did in the classroom will work online, which it's a very different, type of process. And I can certainly meet and talk with you about this. I think it was Jacqueline Smith, Smith, I think. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing. So,
Yeah. Well, and it
um,
looks like we have kind of reached the hour here, and there are some more questions. So I'll be sure to download the questions that we weren't able to answer here so that we can reach out to you.
yeah, because we
Um,
do now have a lot. Everybody was getting
yeah.
on the question thing. So thanks so much for the questions. Just to remind you that we do have a present webinar next week on public administration. So please, if you're in that realm, please take a look at join us for that presentation, and we will be certainly making the PowerPoint available. As I said, both Christina and I do follow up. I will make a copy. There's a copy of this recorded version, but I do make a PDF file, and I see that people are interested, so I'd be happy to attach that to, just a thank you for joining us email from this webinar.
Perfect. I'll do that as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. And Paul, good to see you. I haven't
Yeah, good
got to
to
see
see
you
you.
this year in person,
I
so
know I don't know in-person views, but it's also nice to see you there. So
okay,
you have to come to Paris next.
I'll try. Bye, guys.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody.